Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to this WISE panel, Designing Vibrant and Purposeful Learning Communities. I am Sébastien Turbo. I'm based in Montreal, Canada. I am the co-founder and chief strategist of Equisix, a consultancy helping communities, businesses, and cities design and develop innovation and learning ecosystems. I'm also currently a research fellow for WISE on learning ecosystems, and hence my presence here today as your moderator. Just get my notes. Sorry. Give me 1 second, technical glitch. Thank you. There you go. So learning ecosystems have long been a WISE focus. Indeed, through its learning ecosystem track, WISE has been leading a range of flagship programs, research, and advocacy efforts in identifying best practices and mobilizing its community in co-defining and co-designing impact around local and global learning priorities. Within this mobilization and collaboration effort on learning ecosystems, we are happy today to officially be launching a new WISE program, the Learning Ecosystems Living Lab. This new initiative, anchored in a place-based and a collective design approach, will mobilize practitioners, experts, policymakers, innovators, and learners as a global community of practice and thought leadership on learning ecosystems. This community, we hope, will then support the actual design of key components of learning ecosystems in and across various regions. What type of governance, what type of collaboration models, et cetera, et cetera. More specifically, we really want the lab to be able to support its community by identifying shared challenges and innovative solutions in designing and implementing learning ecosystems. We want this lab to serve as a springboard for content development and research the world over. And of course, we want the lab to serve as a knowledge hub of design principles and best practices. Within this, we are developing a series of online and public thought leadership activities and events for the months and the year to come. And this today is one of them. And so we hope you will join us in this year-round of activities and engage with our community as we are building it. Already, FYI, in just 5 days from now, on December 15th, we will be releasing a first special article series with some amazing and great contributions and insights on learning ecosystems from the world over. For me, truly demonstrating that this is indeed a global conversation. We'll have perspectives on learning ecosystems from Denmark, the UK, Brazil, Oman, the US, India, amongst others. Then later in the new year, we'll be hosting and convening more in-depth conversation on learning ecosystems and smart cities, learning ecosystems and resilience, social cohesion, the skills gap, mega events, and much more. So please follow all the WISE channels to be able to join us when we host these conversations. Before we move on, a little bit of housekeeping. So this session will be divided in 3 parts. We'll first have an introduction keynote, followed by a short Q&A session. Then we'll have a panel discussion, and finally, a global Q&A with your insights and questions. For our introduction keynotes, this will be given to us in Spanish, but English translation is available. Normally, we should have a slide that will be explaining it to you, but basically at the bottom right corner of your Zoom screen, you should be able to choose a language. You can choose English to hear the translation. If you are fluent in Spanish, you can stay in Spanish. It's really up to you, really not difficult. Bottom right corner of that Zoom bar that you have. Also, questions, insights, comments, please share as much as possible. Share whenever you can. You don't need to wait for the official Q&A session. The wonderful WISE team will be filtering and moderating questions back to me, and I will be sharing them directly with our panelists and speakers. Also, please don't hesitate to share your thoughts with your communities using hashtag WISE Living Lab and hashtag Learning Cities. So, as I was saying just a few seconds ago, this is the first panel, the first discussion within the context of this brand new Living Lab, and its focus on learning ecosystems. So, In discussions with the team and discussions with the speakers, we really wanted today to be about laying the foundation of the discussions and thinking to come, to host a macro level kind of a learning ecosystems 101 session, if you want. I know when I tell people in my networks that I'm working on learning ecosystems, intuitively, they're like, okay, I think I see what you're talking about, but I'm not that sure. How is it different from what we're doing today or not? And so, yeah, I want to keep this as overarching as possible and ask some simple questions. How do you define learning ecosystems? Why is there a growing interest in this concept? Is the current crisis an opportunity for learning ecosystems? How do they emerge? What enables or prevents their developments? And finally, how do they impact the community? And to what extent can we actually measure that? So you see a lot of questions that we're going to be covering in 70 to 90 minutes to come. So as I was saying, to launch and introduce today's conversation, it is my pleasure to invite our first speaker for Keynote. Alexandra Agudelo is the current Minister of Education of the city of Medellin in Colombia. Alexandra there is a strong supporter and designer of Medellin's STEM plus H educational approach, an approach that is seeking to develop a science, technology, and innovation framework for the city. In general, Medellin is really appearing big time on the global innovation map. So I know there's great stuff coming out of Medellin. So really happy to have you, Alexandra. It's an honor, and the floor is yours.
Muy bien. Bueno, muy buenos días para todos, a quienes están acá acompañándonos, a quienes nos están viendo por sus pantallas. Y es un honor, el honor es mío de estar acá con ustedes y que una organización como internacional como la de ustedes haga sus miradas, voltee sus miradas hacia una ciudad como la nuestra, una ciudad como Medellín. Entonces yo voy a acá mientras les hablando, lo que les quiero contar entonces de Medellín es que dónde estamos ubicados ahí en el mapa. Nosotros hacemos parte, estamos en Colombia, un departamento pues en Sudamérica primero, Colombia, un departamento Antioquia, y nosotros como Medellín hacemos parte de un área metropolitana de varios municipios que rodean la ciudad de Medellín, pero Medellín es la segunda ciudad de nuestro país, se denomina la ciudad industrial, o la ciudad también la ciudad más innovadora, como hace algunos años también fue denominada, ciudad del aprendizaje también por la UNESCO, y una ciudad para la cuarta revolución industrial. Es una ciudad resiliente por todo lo que ha venido pasando en nuestra sociedad, y una ciudad que hoy le apuesta a la educación, que hoy le apuesta a estrategias y a enfoques como STEM, pero desde una mirada desde lo humano. Digamos que ese es como el plus que Medellín quiere ponerle a un tema como STEM y a una gran transformación educativa y curricular que estamos hoy alcanzando. Quiero agradecer pues nuevamente, por supuesto, a ustedes, Fundación WISE de Qatar, para que conversemos sobre ecosistemas educativos y su importancia en la consolidación de la transformación educativa y cultural como la que estamos realizando en la ciudad de Medellín. Nosotros hoy estamos convencidos, nuestro gobierno inició este año, llevamos un año de gobierno con todas estas particularidades que nos ha tocado vivir, pero con unas grandes oportunidades también que hemos alcanzado y encontrado, sobre todo con ese enfoque de STEM que es tan importante para nosotros y en esa gran transformación educativa. Nosotros tenemos un compromiso enorme con la educación y estamos convencidos que esa transformación social de la que nuestra ciudad es una muestra viviente tiene un pilar fundamental, y es la educación, la cual no puede ser concebida únicamente desde una visión tradicional, en especial con los retos que se nos presentan en la pandemia actual, sino que debemos prepararnos para el afrontar los retos futuros de todas nuestras comunidades de aprendizaje. Quisiera iniciar con una breve descripción del contexto de nuestra ciudad, lo que ya les mostraba ahí en la imagen que ustedes están viendo, que hacemos parte de Colombia, somos un municipio de nuestro país, que es Colombia, capital del departamento de Antioquia, y como les decía, es la segunda ciudad mayor del país. Nuestra capital es Bogotá y Medellín es la segunda ciudad. Tenemos una población de alrededor de 2.5 millones de habitantes y Medellín tiene una extensión territorial de 375 kilómetros, donde el 73% del territorio corresponde al área rural y el 27% es un área urbana. Incluso pues los invito a todos a conocer Medellín. Cuando la conozcan, el riesgo va a ser que se quieran quedar todos acá en nuestra ciudad, así que todos están invitados. Después de haber sido al final del siglo anterior una de las ciudades más peligrosas del mundo, lamentablemente así fuimos catalogados en algún momento por el tráfico de drogas, Medellín ha logrado transformarse drásticamente y convertirse en una ciudad activa, creativa y resiliente, como les decía. Somos una ciudad absolutamente resiliente. El trabajo en educación ha tenido un gran impacto en lo social y lo cultural de nuestra ciudad. Entre los años 1983 y el 94, Medellín sufrió alrededor de 46.000 muertes violentas. Este panorama es una historia violenta que propició un proceso de transformación cultural basado en la inversión en educación y en la continuidad de las políticas públicas para el siglo XXI. Medellín dejó de estar en la lista de las ciudades más violentas del mundo y es ahora reconocida por sus procesos de innovación, de transformación, que han sido posibles por el compromiso de todas las autoridades locales desde esa época, todos los gobiernos que han venido, que hemos seguido construyendo desde lo construido, y creo que eso ha sido muy importante para nuestra ciudad y sobre todo en el tema de educación. Para la actual administración, nuestro alcalde Daniel Quintero, la continuidad de las políticas públicas en educación sigue siendo un factor clave de la transformación social y educativa de la ciudad, con un incremento cercano al 18% en el presupuesto en educación del periodo 2020 a 2023 respecto a la administración anterior. Medellín sigue creyendo firmemente en la recuperación de lo social, en la integración de los grupos vulnerables, para garantizarles la equidad y el acceso a la educación de calidad. Esto es muy importante porque en estos momentos tenemos la mayor inversión en educación de muchos tiempos y solo una línea estratégica en nuestro plan de desarrollo que habla solamente de educación, y eso es una apuesta muy importante para nuestra ciudad. Hay un trabajo comprometido de Medellín en torno a los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible, garantizando la inclusión de los grupos vulnerables y los empodera con las herramientas necesarias para transformar sus entornos. La apuesta de una Medellín futuro, así la llamamos nosotros actualmente, una Medellín futuro, que tiene como pilares la cuarta revolución industrial para el desarrollo económico de los sectores menos favorecidos, que se fortalecen desde el talento joven, así como los trabajos en torno a generar espacios sostenibles y en especial cuidado del medio ambiente para la consolidación de una ecociudad. Nos permite la consolidación de nuestro plan de desarrollo. Medellín ha sido galardonada como ciudad del aprendizaje por la UNESCO, como les decía, y como tal buscamos la integración de los grupos vulnerables para garantizarles la equidad y el acceso a la educación, ya que estamos convencidos que desde la educación podemos cerrar las brechas sociales que afectan nuestros entornos y contextos complejos y cambiantes. Entendemos que una comunidad del aprendizaje es aquella que involucra a los diferentes actores educativos en la transformación cultural y educativa de un territorio, un proceso en el cual nos hemos comprometido como ciudad en el siglo XXI, generando un gran ecosistema de aprendizaje en el cual la apropiación del conocimiento se hace en los diferentes espacios, los cuales se articulan con un proyecto cultural de ciudad, fundado en los derechos culturales que fortalezcan el potencial creativo de todos los ciudadanos. Nos caracterizamos por movilizar de un modo efectivo los recursos en todos los sectores para la promoción de un aprendizaje inclusivo desde la educación básica hacia la superior, garantizando, como lo manifiesta la UNESCO, propiciar el aprendizaje a lo largo de toda la vida, pero igualmente facilitamos el aprendizaje en diferentes espacios no formales, generando una sociedad de aprendizaje que desde la temprana edad y el hogar inician el camino para la excelencia educativa. Igualmente pretendemos crear un sistema de innovación educativa de básica primaria y secundaria que consolide los centros del Valle del Software y en lo que se puede generar contenidos digitales en educación. Nosotros estamos buscando también generar en la ciudad, y ese es uno de los grandes proyectos como ciudad, no solamente como educación, sino como desarrollo económico, crear a Medellín como un gran valle del software, donde hoy se incuben empresas de tecnología en la ciudad, pero también haciendo una gran transformación. Educación, el sector educativo tiene una gran deuda con todos los colegios, el Estado, de hacer una reforma no solamente tecnológica, sino también de infraestructura física, y eso lo estamos haciendo y lo estamos también garantizando para los estudiantes. En Medellín tenemos 12.000 docentes, son 12.000 maestros que están en nuestro sistema. Tenemos 229 instituciones educativas que albergan 350.000 estudiantes, todo esto de carácter oficial. Nuestro sistema educativo se divide en oficial o privado, entonces en el privado, junto con el privado y el oficial, tenemos más de 450.000 estudiantes y tenemos un programa muy bonito que es el programa de Buen Comienzo, que es lo que habla por eso el aprendizaje para toda la vida. Un buen comienzo, un programa de niños de 0 a 5 años, donde si no tenemos un buen comienzo, pues no habrá un buen recorrido. Ese es también nuestro objetivo. Y una agencia de educación superior garantizándole la educación superior y la continuidad a todos nuestros estudiantes. Así que buscamos crear espacios donde construyamos procesos formativos, culturales y artísticos. Por eso es tan importante el tema del ser más STEM. Nosotros creemos que el STEM, ciencia, tecnología, ingeniería, matemáticas, también es posible trabajarlo desde las ciencias humanas, desde el ser, desde ese ser que habita todos los espacios de nuestra ciudad, de hablar de una transformación educativa y curricular, pero hablarla en contexto, hablarla para cada una de las instituciones de nuestra ciudad y hablarla en temas de territorio, porque también, como ahora, nosotros tenemos un gran porcentaje de educación rural y otro porcentaje más pequeño de urbana. Entonces esas grandes brechas hay que empezarlas a cerrar y en eso estamos comprometidos. Es por ello que estamos convencidos de seguir trabajando de la mano de aliados como ustedes, como la UNESCO, por supuesto con WISE, para que juntos como comunidades de aprendizaje, para nosotros es muy importante seguir creando estos lazos, seguir creando estas redes y estas comunidades de aprendizaje para que nos reimaginemos la educación con un proyecto claro de futuro, con miras a 2050 y más allá, por supuesto, el cual debemos realizar todos los actores comprometidos con la educación en el mundo. Los procesos en educación son lentos, desafortunadamente, pero si seguimos y si creamos esta red de aprendizaje y si nos encontramos entre todos y si nos vemos el uno al otro y cómo nos podemos apoyar, seguramente la educación saldrá adelante, sobre todo en estos tiempos que tenemos que pensar en el post-COVID, porque hoy todos sabemos lo que estamos pasando, cómo lo estamos viviendo, qué ha sufrido la educación. Yo particularmente, a mí me duele mucho ver los colegios vacíos, porque creo que los colegios tienen que estar llenos de estudiantes, que los niños, que las niñas, que los jóvenes tienen que estar en el colegio, en la institución educativa, no en las casas, y que hemos perdido mucho porque hoy hemos estado trabajando en pro de aprendizajes, más no de formación. No estamos formando a nuestros niños y niñas, y ese lugar de socialización, ese lugar de encuentro que es precisamente el colegio, hoy no está, y no podremos hablar de una apertura total de las ciudades, de los países, de los territorios, hasta que la educación no esté completamente abierta. Así que este era pues como un poco la introducción, un poco lo que quiero contarles desde acá, desde mi ciudad, de mi bella Medellín, y decirles que, bueno, atentos siempre a que podamos seguir trabajando en red y construir una red. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. This was really fascinating. Once again, Medellin is quite an impressive model, and actually we hope to be hearing from you in the city in the months to come. A few questions coming in, Alexandra. Several questions around how you would define, this ecosystemic learning approach in Medellin. You were talking about the fourth industrial revolution, the question of digital education, the gaps. How does this fit into an ecosystemic approach to learning?
Bueno, yo creo que el ecosistema y uno del éxito, precisamente de los éxitos que ha tenido Medellín, es trabajar en conjunto, trabajar en equipo en pro de la educación, en este caso pues de la educación. La empresa ha estado siempre dispuesta a apoyar, hay fundaciones que confluyen en términos de empresa. Nosotros tenemos un área de cooperación muy importante, precisamente de cooperación educativa para seguir avanzando en esto, pero también el Estado ha estado muy pendiente de todo lo que pasa y lo que les decía ahora, construir sobre lo construido, o sea, no borrar, que pasa mucho acá mismo en nuestro país, en otros municipios, en otras poblaciones, pero también en nuestro continente, que borran todo, entonces pasa el gobierno 4 años y es volver a empezar, entonces ahí perdemos y se pierde todo el tiempo, y sobre todo en educación. Acá no. Acá hemos tratado de que los programas buenos persistan. Les pongo un ejemplo. Yo estoy hoy, en este momento, ustedes ven atrás mío, este es el Centro de Formación de Innovación y de Investigación del Maestro, un centro bellísimo que tienen que conocer, que los invito. Y esto fue construido en gobiernos anteriores, pero que nosotros hoy estamos potenciando absolutamente, que nosotros hoy estamos buscando que esto sea un centro de investigación y tratando de que nuestros maestros realmente investiguen y tener grupos de investigación. Y esto fue pensado en gobiernos anteriores, y aquí estamos, un ecosistema donde está el parque de investigación de la ciudad, donde estamos todos confluyendo en pro de la educación y que sea una educación de calidad. Yo creo que eso es muy importante cuando hablamos de un ecosistema.
Look, I did not know you were at the Teachers Innovation Center. It seems quite beautiful and impressive, so congratulations on that. Actually, one last question before we move on to the panel. So you've just been mentioning teachers. Some people are asking how you involve learners themselves in the design around this, systemic approach and these new programs.
Bueno, los docentes son fundamentales. Yo creo que pues es una frase también que repetimos mucho, pero que si nosotros no hacemos un proceso con los docentes, pues todo se pierde y no hay proceso, sino que hay actividades que realizamos. Podemos hacer talleres con estudiantes en torno, por ejemplo, al tema de ser más STEM, pero los estudiantes van pasando y se van graduando. Por eso desde acá, desde MOVA, tenemos ya unas redes de maestros muy importantes, red de maestros en cultura, por ejemplo, estamos haciendo un gran avance y una gran articulación con el tema de cultura de ciudad, y vamos a inaugurar incluso un lugar como escuela, se llama Escuela del Maestro, pero donde vamos a dinamizar toda la estrategia cultural y educativa para los maestros en Medellín. Pero también esa red, tenemos la red de maestros STEM, que viene trabajando en actividades, talleres, pero que está levantando también investigaciones para el aula en todo lo que tiene que ver con STEM. Y eso es muy importante, por eso este centro de formación de MOVA es tan importante para nuestro sistema educativo, para nuestra ciudad y para el país y para el mundo, además de que acá es el lugar de encuentro y como lo he dicho yo, como lo digo yo en varias ocasiones, el lugar de habitar los maestros, porque esto hay que habitarlo. O sea, un lugar cobra sentido si se habita. Es un lugar bonito como MOA, pero vacío, como muchos otros, pues no cobra sentido. Y MOA cobra sentido en la medida en que los docentes están acá con nosotros trabajando en esa red en este caso, pues como les cuento, la red de maestros STEM, pero tenemos otra red también de maestros, de desarrollo humano, de otros temas que también nos encontramos acá, hacer talleres y que no solamente lo académico nos convoca a un lugar como estos, sino también otros eventos como cocina, que ellos vengan y cocinen, tejan, algunos de los adornos navideños que ustedes ven acá detrás mío fueron hechos precisamente por los mismos maestros. Entonces, ellos juegan un papel trascendental y fundamental en esto.
Well, thank you very much, Alexandra. You know, I could hear from Medellin for hours, but it's time for us to move to the panel. But you will be staying with us for the panel, so we'll be hearing more from you. It's now time for me to invite formally our other panelists. So I'd like to welcome Gu Sonjo, Rosie Clayton, and David Achuarena. Thank you all for being here. Let me introduce you quickly. Sonjo, you are the Chief Futurist, Chief Research Officer, and Chief Skills Officer at the Skills Future Singapore Agency. I also believe that you've held a number of positions in the Singaporean government. I was told that your research interests are quite fascinating and include capitalism in the digital economy, new economy firms, skills ecosystems, and skills policies. So thank you for being here. David, you have been the director of the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning since April 2018. Previously, you were the director of the Division for Policies and Lifelong Learning Systems at UNESCO, which included policy, higher education, TVET, and technology in education. You also lead UNESCO's Learning Cities Initiative, which we will be discussing later, as both Singapore and Medellin are part of this network. So welcome, David. Finally, Rosie. Rosie, you are the co-founder of Weaving Lab, an organization rethinking the purpose and practice of education systems and systems leadership around the world. You are also somewhat of a colleague of mine because you are also a research fellow at WISE, and you are currently working on a Qatar-focused, place-based learning approaches which connect informal and formal learning to drive pedagogical innovation. But so let's dig in. Don't remember, share your questions, share your feedback, your comments as we go in the chat box. And so as I was saying in my intro, I want to start really macro, really high, really have this 101 session. So I'll ask you all in turn to very quickly tell us more about your work and how specifically it links to learning ecosystems. And also, how would you define a learning ecosystem? Or at least, if you tell me defining is hard, what would you say are the main attributes of a learning ecosystem? Maybe Sonjo, let me start with you. You're still on mute, Sonjo.
Sorry. Thank you very much for the introductions, Sebastian, and thank you, Alexandra, for the beautiful narrative of the city in Colombia, how you go about designing the ecosystem. Okay, my work in Skill Future Singapore, I lead a team of analysts and data scientists to look into the kind of new jobs or job changes and skills changes within globally, locally, and regionally, in order for us to be able to anticipate skills changes and jobs changes because of the economy's transformation, so that we can inform, we can push out the kind of insights to get education and training organizations to roll out the courses, and then to get individual citizens and also enterprises to understand what kind of skills is needed to support the industry. So in a nutshell, that's what we do in Singapore, especially my groups of colleagues working with me. I would define a learning ecosystem as Alexandra has mentioned earlier on. It is about key stakeholders coming in together to have a shared purpose of why learning is important from an economic perspective and a social perspective, and how can they design the kind of alignment to make sure that the supply and the demands of learning really can create the kind of outcome, a social economic outcome for the citizens. So that will mean to try to close the skills gap or to anticipate what learning is needed at workplaces, so that higher learning institutions can come together. So it takes the hands of government, trade unions, employers groups, education institutions, and also equally important is the other workplaces. So it requires government policy, the market sizing, the labor market informations. Also, all these kind of stakeholders must come together to seek alignment, and as today's theme talk about vibrant and purposeful learning, I think that kind of sums up what I see as learning ecosystem. Thank you.
Okay, so I hear stakeholders, alignment, purpose, diversity, supply and demand, skills gap. David, how about you? How would you, I mean, please tell us a bit more about your work with your focus on lifelong learning and how it links to learning ecosystems.
Thank you, Sebastian, and thanks again for inviting me to join this discussion and this panel. It was a pleasure to listen to the minister from Medellin. A year ago, we were actually in Medellin, which hosted the 4th International Conference of Learning Cities, and it was really a great opportunity to observe and learn from all the achievements and the transformation of the city over several decades, in which lifelong learning played a very important role. The UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning is an institute which is precisely dedicated to working with member states around policies for promoting lifelong learning. And it has, I would say, a particular significance at the moment since 2015 with the adoption of the SDGs, where lifelong learning is now recognized as the overarching concept and vision for education. So we do work in the field of policy support, policy analysis, research as well. We are actually engaged in some research with some of you, like in Singapore, with future skills, and also in capacity building. Networking is also an important element, and I think networking is also at the heart of the concept of eco-learning systems, because although we use the term system, I believe that maybe it has more to do with the notion of networks, which are connected and together also connect different stakeholders to promote and facilitate learning. So I would say that learning ecosystems for us relates to the broad environment which enables, which incentivizes, which supports lifelong learning, meaning lifelong learning really for all. So it's about the institutions, of course, about the stakeholders. It's about also the pedagogy and the provision, and it's about the financial mechanisms. I think it's important, of course, to reflect on how providers, are linked to each other, and how by bringing providers together in that ecosystem, you can actually facilitate and build those learning pathways, which are key to make really lifelong learning possible. But to make these dynamics actually possible, you also need to have other elements in this environment, in particular in relation, starting with the demand. You need people really to have an appetite for learning and for learning throughout life. Sometimes lifelong learning is seen or even, promoted more as a duty. The 4th industrial revolution, workers have to, keep learning, throughout their entire life, and they have also to work longer. So it makes lifelong learning even more needed. So I think it's important to see what kind of incentives can be promoted, and the tools also and the mechanism that can help people to locate, to identify, the provision which are relevant for them, and to provide those individualized assistance. So we see with also now the emergence of new tools with the technology, how the entire area of career guidance is actually moving, and how systems in particular now with artificial intelligence are gradually built to facilitate individualized guidance. So this really make the navigation within this ecosystem much easier. I'd like also to stress, maybe just to end, that in this vision, what is also quite important is the collective dimension. It's really about, in that system, it's how you learn from others and with others, that to see also learning, lifelong learning as a continuity, but also as a social process. And this collective dimension is very well reflected when related to a particular location, a particular space. And this is why the concept of learning territories, learning cities is so relevant. And as we can see now in most parts of the world, is really an emerging vision to actually reinterpret, lifelong learning, and to build those learning ecosystems very close to, there is this dimension of proximity, close to the learners, and also responding to the concrete problems that learners are, exposed to as learners, but also as workers, and more broadly as citizens.
Thank you, David. You were just finishing on the question of, the place, the importance of the place-based approach, learning cities, learning territories. It's something we'll come to later, but which I think is really key in this conversation. You also mentioned learning pathways, and something tells me this resonated with Rosie and her own work and experience. So Rosie, tell us more about your work and how it relates to learning ecosystems, please.
Yeah, thank you, Seb. Thank you very much. And absolutely, new learning pathways is my main area of interest and expertise, I suppose. So yeah, I'm involved in an organisation called the Weaving Lab. We support different organisations and groups and entities around the world to design and develop learning ecosystems, focusing on this notion of a person as a weaver of connections, of collaborations, particularly at the level of place. And as you mentioned, Seb, I'm also a research fellow with WISE. And we're looking very much at how we can develop place-based learning ecosystems in Qatar. And what that kind of is manifesting and looking like is thinking about how we can kind of incentivize and motivate engagement in learning through connecting different forms of learning. So learning that takes place in formal settings, for example, in schools and colleges and universities, and learning that takes place in informal learning settings, so cultural institutions, sports facilities, parks, gardens, the city as a learning platform, really, as a metaphor. So really interested in the idea of how kind of an ecosystemic lens and frame can think about that connectivity of different learning experiences. And one of the things that I found through working on this is that it takes and requires a new form of systems leadership, which the other panelists have alluded to, different types of organisations that maybe don't work together typically, coming together around a common vision and a common mission. So bringing together employers, education providers, municipal governments, and voluntary sector organisations to set a vision for learning for that particular place, and then think about the kind of strategies and the pedagogical approaches and the funding vehicles and models and the evaluation tools that can then be implemented to look at, to decide what and see what success looks like over time. So I think there's a huge amount of interest rightly growing in this area, and particularly as the pandemic has almost forced and enabled new types of collaborations between different partners. So this is something we're going to be looking at, particularly in the Qatari context, but hoping to generate learnings for the world and for other places to adapt and adopt.
So you were just mentioning the COVID crisis. when I look at this whole conversation around learning ecosystems, it had been gradually growing, over the past few years, but it seems that with the crisis, but maybe not, I'm going to ask you, that there's a really growing interest around this concept. Why do you believe educators, businesses, employers, cities believe that this ecosystemic approach to learning is valuable? And I'll be the provocateur here in saying that, sometimes when I talk to more kind of, representative of the formal sector, schools and universities, sometimes tell me, but wait, this whole thing around learning ecosystems, is this just not a way to kind of bypass us? So why do you believe it's valuable? And this question is to all four of you, including you, Alexandra. What do you think it's valuable? Why this growing interest? And what would you say to someone coming from a more formal sector to reassure them on the fact that this has value for them as well? And it's not just a new buzzword to kind of bypass them. Anyone want to go first? Sonjo, you are unmuted, so I will invite you first.
Okay. Okay, I would say that the concept of a ecosystem is not new. It's been around for ages, for many decades, and the fact that we need, because learning takes place, first is learning is very social. We learn together, we don't learn in silo, and learning is usually, there is a motivation, there is a reason, and the fact that we need an ecosystem to make it happen, because you can't, it has to be purposeful, and I thought it gets more and more important, because the fact that, from my perspective, the fact that the world is changing so rapidly, and all of us are trying to, in all the cities, we're trying to make an attempt to close the skills gap. This is one of the common agenda across the world. And like some of the audience were asking questions about what kind of incentive, or David talked about what kind of incentive. And incentive, all these are enabler that we are trying to incentivize. But I think more importantly, today's, as we all know, big data has allowed us to also put up insights or signposts to help people understand why there is the need to change. So the kind of ecosystem concept means it is not about a single person silo wanted to learn, but there is a purpose, and there are people, there are institutions, mechanisms trying to help them learn better, including technology. We can learn online without going to schools. We can learn from each other. We can learn from online community. So this whole concept of a network, or Rosie talk about the weaving of all the people will know the network connecting up. So I think that ecosystem will get more and more important moving forward with internet facilitating. So I think the concept of having the needs and the supply and the demand meeting each other is become more and more critical. That's how I see that. Thank you.
Thanks. Alexandra or David, do you want to chip in? Or Rosie, apparently you had your hand raised. So Rosie, please go first.
No, I was just going to build on what Sanji said to basically say, I think there's, like Sanji said, ecosystems are not a new idea in and of themselves, but there's sort of a recognition now that some of the kind of intractable challenges that different organizations have been grappling with for years can't be solved by any one organization alone, and that we have to work together. We have to work together in new ways. Organizations need to work together in new ways to tackle things like skills gaps, equity gaps, issues around inclusion. And a core part of that is developing collaborative cultures between organizations, common languages, common ways to understand some of these problems and challenges. And certainly during the pandemic, schools, for example, have had to draw upon and mobilize other resources within their communities to help them deliver learning in new ways. And I'd say schools themselves have almost transformed into new types of organizations where they're offering physical learning on site for certain groups of learners. They're operating as online entities, and in some communities they're providing welfare services of some form or another. So there's almost been an imperative to shift to more ecosystemic ways of working, and it will be interesting to see what functions remains beyond the course of the pandemic. You know, what new types of collaboration and operational models that have sprung up and emerged remain beyond. So I think, you know, I think it's an idea of its time and has been kind of catalyzed through the experiences this year.
David, from a kind of UNESCO kind of more global perspective, would you agree with what's being said?
Yes, I think the emergence of this approach is linked to the recognition of the need to adopt a broader, you know, vision, a more holistic vision of education, training, of learning in general. I think that it is related really to a sense that, of course, the school system is key, but it's not enough. You need to look beyond, and certainly if you want to promote lifelong learning, you cannot only, you know, invest in school education and in school. You need to have a much broader perspective, but you need also to move beyond I would say the education sector itself. Again, provision is not only the education sector. A lot of the provision is, you know, now in the, I would say, private sector through digital ways of learning. It is also a lot about workplace learning. Workplace learning is a considerable, you know, element of lifelong learning. So, I mean, this, you know, need to reconcile, and recognize, and also build, you know, articulation between those different segments of the ecosystem is something that we see being increasingly recognized. And then it's not only about learning. I mean, learning in itself, of course, it's important, but it is as important as it also contributes to achieving, you know, other purposes in terms of employment, in terms of welfare, in terms of social cohesion, and of course also in terms of public health, as we saw during the pandemic. So this relevance, this link between learning and other dimensions of development and of life is something which is essential, and which calls, again, we spoke about the stakeholders, which calls from really building coalitions, you know, and collaborations between different stakeholders at central level, but also at local level. So it relates to also the development of new types of public policies, which are much more inter-ministerial, but also, you know, transversal, meaning that they apply and they involve different, you know, sectors in governance.
Alexandra, I see you had your camera back on. Do you want to chip into this, please?
Sí, pues escuchándolos atentamente, creo que el tema pues de crear unos ecosistemas en nuestras ciudades y en nuestros territorios es fundamental, porque la educación sola, aparte, pues como un sector únicamente, no puede verse, no puede trascender, no podemos tener grandes posibilidades para maestros, además que los recursos, por lo menos en países como el nuestro, los recursos nunca serán suficientes. Hoy tenemos la mayor inversión en la historia en términos educativos, como sector educativo en Medellín. Sin embargo, siempre hace falta algo, lo que les decía ahora, hay una deuda gigante en términos de infraestructura física, por ejemplo. Así que crear esos ecosistemas en torno al aprendizaje y en torno a la educación es fundamental.
Thank you. You mentioned the question of resources. We'll come back to that in a second. Just so you know, here I'm speaking to all four of you. Lots of questions coming in on, could the speakers give us a quick, simple, but strong example of what they would consider a robust learning ecosystem? So I'd let you think of that for a few minutes. But before we go to that, indeed, on the resources issue just mentioned by Alexandra, what would you say are the main kind of enablers or hindering factors of learning ecosystems? Is it about culture? Is it about organizations? Is it about resource? Is it about actually executing on the learning ecosystem? I know, Sonjo, you mentioned the resources also earlier before. I know, Rosie, you talk about culture. David, you mentioned the resource question as well. So quickly, in your own views, what are the main enablers and hindering factors, enabling and hindering factors of learning ecosystems? Maybe can I invite you maybe David to start?
Yes, well, I think the very important element, first of all, is really the vision, the vision and the policy which is put in place to actually, make this approach, implement this approach in a very concrete manner. So I think that, of course, the resources are important as well, but the starting point, must be the strong political will to change, I would say, the paradigm and actually embrace this much more holistic vision, which includes and involves a much wider diversity of stakeholders, different levels of implementation, and also a range of, I would say, services and mechanisms around the teaching and learning process itself. So it's not only about really, delivering our education, giving access to knowledge. It's also about providing the incentives, the mechanisms, but the tools also. And one of them, for instance, which is key, it has to do with recognition, validation of learning outcomes. The development of mechanisms to actually recognize learning and learning outcomes wherever they come from, including through experiential learning, prior learning. This is it's key to actually, implement and facilitate those lifelong learning pathways. So the vision and the policy first, but second are all the, I would say, parameters, the facilitating parameters that actually, promote and encourage and support the demand and provide and guide actually learners to have access to a diversity of provision, not only in the formal education system, but also, outside of the education system, and this for all ages throughout life.
Okay, so vision, political will, question of assessments, lots of things there. Sonjo, anything you want to add or to follow up on David?
I thought David has given a pretty comprehensive account. Maybe I just very quickly give an example in Singapore how
please.
mobilize the ecosystem. Definitely, I think the policy intent about a competitive economy where every citizen benefits and everybody is an inclusive growth that everybody will benefit. And what does it mean? Means every citizen should have the right skill sets to take advantage of where the economy is going. And that is true, enabling them to understand where the skills need, what kind of where the economy is going, and these are the kind of skills that are in demand. And once we identify the skills together with the employers and the industry, then we also need to make sure that the university, the polytechnic, the Institute of Technical Educations are able to provide the courses that are relevant to the citizens at the right time. So the quality of education, the quality of learning design must be there. And when the citizens go through the training and they truly are able to get the kind of right jobs, able to perform well at workplaces, and at the same time is also at the employers at the workplace, because the employers' role are not just using the skills, they are the one that identify skills with us, they are the one that jointly develop the skills at workplaces, because as David said, it is the development of skills is not the mere responsibility of institutions. It has to be workplace as well. So that kind of integrating at workplaces, how employees use the skills identified and develop skills and recognize and pay for skills. It is very important, because how they use the skills means they can see the skills. The workplaces allow individuals who has a skill set to able to apply themselves and make sure the businesses are successful, and that return will be good wages, will be good employment. And that kind of system is very important. And from a government perspective is, then how do we measure? How do we show that? How do we measure and show that it is, everything is, or the system is doing okay? So from end of course evaluations, we do evaluate whether the course is doing well at the program level, but we also measure the end outcome, for example, employment rate, unemployment rate, the kind of skills gap. Are we closing skills gap fast enough? Do we have, let's say in 2018, you identify this is the kind of skills gap. In 2020, do we see that the skills gap is closer? What are the kind of new emerging skills? So that whole dynamic of policy intent, as David said, to actually the ability to execute on the ground, to mobilize workplaces, employers, work with the labor unions, work with the education training institutions together, and then to monitor the kind of effectiveness, I think is key. And very quickly is incentive. We do give every Singaporean 25-year-old and above $500 in 2016, so that everybody every year then 25-year-old will get amount of money. And in October we just do a top up. So if you have not utilized the Singaporean, you will have $1,000. For citizens 40 and above, they have another $500, so about $1,500, so that they can think about in the mid to longer term what exactly they want to invest in themselves. And that $500 is to defray the out-of-pocket expenses, even though all the curated courses are already subsidized by the government, by the SkillsFuture Singapore. We already subsidize the cost to bring down the expenses so that it's become affordable. So from our perspective, the measure is also accessibility, the accessibility of different workforce segment, because typically the professional, manager, executive level tend to be able to do better as that's a kind of learning, but the non-executive workforce in a workforce tend not to. So how can we make sure that there is this equal access, and not just because the system is there, you ought to do it yourself, but we really watch over the participation, age group, skill level. I think we will really carefully watch over and say that we should really making sure that everybody have equal access and equal opportunity to realize the fullest potential. I think that is the whole, I would say in summary, is the whole kind of ecosystem from a macro perspective, policy, all the way to executions, all the way to monitoring. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Sunjo. So integration, measurement, execution, incentives, and the financing side. On the financing, it's almost a whole question in itself, which I hope we'll be able to cover in a few weeks, few months from now, because I know is a key question looking at learning ecosystems. Alexandra, from your Medellin policymaker experience, what do you think are the main enablers or hinders of developing learning ecosystems?
Bueno, yo creo que ya lo decía David, y es que el tema de las políticas públicas es muy importante y ha sido muy importante para Medellín. O sea, darle continuidad a esas políticas públicas asentadas en este sistema educativo para conformar ese ecosistema. Yo creo que es fundamental los recursos, porque es que sin recursos también no es posible avanzar. No es posible avanzar en este sistema. Sin recursos, no, este centro de formación del maestro, por ejemplo, no sería posible, por citarles algo. O los recursos los necesitamos nosotros hoy para poder dotar de tecnología a todas las instituciones educativas nuestras. Entonces, eso es fundamental. Han sentado esas políticas públicas, los maestros comprometidos en esto. Pero también Medellín ha dado un salto importante en conformar ese ecosistema educativo, y es las empresas, el sector privado. El sector privado siempre apoyando y siempre de cara a lo que es la educación. Nosotros tenemos una experiencia como educación superior que es el Comité Universidad Empresa Estado, el CUE lo llamamos nosotros, y ese comité precisamente es la empresa involucrada con todos los temas educativos, con pertinencia educativa, con calidad educativa, qué ellos están requiriendo, qué tipo de profesionales o qué tipo de personas están requiriendo. Y por eso nosotros ahí también incluimos ese ser más, porque qué tipo de seres. Muchas veces lo que se necesitan son seres humanos, porque lo técnico lo pueden aprender ya dentro de las empresas, y esa articulación que hacemos nosotros con las empresas también desde la educación básica ha sido fundamental para crear ese ecosistema, porque ellos, por ejemplo, nos ofrecen semilleros para los estudiantes, de modo que los estudiantes puedan estar formándose en otras habilidades o en otras competencias diferentes a las que están en el colegio, y puedan después hacer una línea para el trabajo, para seguir en esas otras empresas que les abren las puertas, para hablar de orientación vocacional y demás. Entonces yo creo que es muy importante eso, y por supuesto para ese ecosistema educativo una gestión administrativa en el tema educativo al frente de personas que conozcan la educación, pero también que conozcan los temas públicos, que conozcan del tema de gestión como tal, gestión administrativa, porque no basta solamente con conocer y con querer hacer cosas bonitas de la educación, sino también conocer toda esa gestión administrativa. Creo yo que esos podrían ser los componentes para poder crear un ecosistema de aprendizaje, un ecosistema educativo pues en la ciudad, y poderlo replicar también en otros territorios.
Thank you for that. My main takeaway is on the continue.
Can I just add a point to what Alexandra just mentioned? I thought she raised a very important point, which I thought I didn't mention, that the ecosystem truly required research to support, because the investment in research to support evidence-informed policy and practice is very, very key. So I think we also fund research, researchers to look into areas that we need to explore further. How can we enhance better policy and better practice? And the other aspect that since Alexandra is in the Teacher Innovation Center, I think that in the whole ecosystem, we also truly need to pay attention to the educators, those who are really designing learning, facilitating learning, and we do pay a lot of attention in this area of the capability, the capacity of the educators, especially not just about the foundational skills, but for example, when COVID hit, when all of us are on circuit breaker, there's no face-to-face classroom, we have to ask ourselves whether the educators are ready to go online, to facilitate online kind of learning, and do they have, I think we are fortunate that Singapore has good internet. Overnight we can actually get people to just call each other and say, do you have a laptop at home? If not, where can you get it? And the educator have to go online to facilitate a lot of learning, and that is not easy. So we watch over the space of research, the space of educator, and also the capability of education training institutions in the area of career facilitation, especially the school to work, and also those who are displaced. Let's say COVID hit and the business is down, they get retrenched. How can we help the retrenched to get back into jobs? Not just about going for training, because training has to get them to the job. So that the career facilitation as well is a very important part of the ecosystem. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Rosie, I'll turn to you quickly, if you want, on the kind of enablers and hinderers on learning ecosystems, but also maybe transitions through you in giving an example, a concrete example. I know you know many of them. You've actually worked on one of what I think is one of the most impressive learning ecosystems, which is the City of Learning project. But please, so enablers, hinderers, and directly into give us an amazing, inspiring example of a learning ecosystem according to you.
That's quite a challenge. Just to really quickly pick up on what Sanju was saying, I mean, really kind of showing the kind of agility really that an ecosystem enables in responding to immediate needs and challenges, whether that's getting technology out to young people at home or whatever it might mean. So just wanted to, in terms of an enabler of a learning ecosystem, I would say there needs to be an element of kind of ecosystem coordination and stewardship and sort of management, I suppose, and an entity that drives that, whether that's municipal government or a kind of a collaborative entity or body of some sort. But that role of actually sort of orchestrating an ecosystem and enabling that agility is vital. And just linked to that quickly, I would say the role of trust between different organizations. So effective learning ecosystems I found have high trust between the different partners who are involved, and that takes time and effort and work and kind of relationship building and knowledge sharing and things like that. In terms of, yeah, I mean, there are so many different examples of really effective learning ecosystems, and as you mentioned, I was previously in a previous role working on a project called Cities of Learning, and we were again looking at places and cities within the UK where we were developing kind of localized models of quite sophisticated partnerships between employers, municipal government, schools, colleges, to think about setting that long-term vision for education, to then design new pathways through learning across a particular city. So bringing together those different types of providers to think about how they could connect learning that went on in schools with learning that went on outside of schools, around certain sort of thematic pathways, whether that was certain skills like maybe creativity or team working or sectoral needs, so manufacturing, construction, or things like well-being and sustainability. So, you know, grouping different learning providers into these sort of thematic clusters. And then we developed systems of digital open badges or micro-credentials to give value to these different forms of learning and to enable the learner to basically access a platform where they could visualize all the different opportunities available within their local area, and move sort of seamlessly between these different types of opportunities towards certain destinations, whether that was into employment or into further learning, or just for their own kind of personal well-being or furthering their own particular interests in terms of lifelong learning. So it was sort of a combination of design principles of that sort of local leadership being really critical, that bringing together of networks of different providers, and then utilizing digital technologies and digital credentials to give a value and a visibility to different forms of learning. So that was, yeah, one example of many, but I think that system learning piece and that orchestration piece is really important as well, and the policy side of things.
Once again, fascinating project. If you haven't looked into it, do look into it. David, on the kind of practical examples of learning ecosystems, I'd like to link this to your work and your not oversight, but your global vision on learning cities. From the cities you work with, would you have what you would consider as really a very significant example of what a strong learning city / learning ecosystem approach would look like in any given cities or in several cities?
Thank you. I think that what Rosie described just now is very much in line, with the learning city concept, which is not a concept recognizing, I would say, necessarily, top performers in terms of, the level of achievement in education and I would say in lifelong learning in general, but which describes cities that have a dedicated, policy and strategy for actually promoting lifelong learning for all. We have also a strong focus on inclusion, and this is maybe something that needs to be stressed. I think it's also very much relevant for this concept of ecosystem. We are, and we've seen that even more clearly during this year of COVID-19 crisis in societies where inequalities are not only wide, but also I would say in most countries actually increasing. So there is a key challenge in terms of public policies on how to actually, reduce those gaps, reduce those inequalities that are very much reflected in education, in terms of access, in terms of achievement, but then later on also are translated into other spheres of people's life. In terms of employment, in terms of health, in terms of cultural development, and so on. So, this focus on inclusion is also a very important element of learning cities, where we see that this approach is not only related to the education policy, but also to social policies. And I remember, for instance, in Medellin, we had very interesting discussions about that, and how the city is combining this approach in some of the most vulnerable, areas of the city, where the approach is very much to actually identify, vulnerable families, and to follow up, their development, and how they actually take benefit of the different opportunities in terms of education, but also how they can benefit from other types of, welfare support from the city. So this, this approach of combining learning opportunities with other forms of support is something which is quite important. I'd like also to, because I saw in the chat that we had also colleagues who were asking questions about Africa, and what happens in places which are not as economically developed as some of the examples that we mentioned so far. I think it's important so not to forget rural areas and really environments where poverty is the reality for most of the population. So what does this concept of ecosystem means in such a context? So I think, again, we need to see how to make the best use of the existing institutions, not only the schools, but also community learning centers, healthcares, local public libraries, and see how they can actually be linked also together. How schools can also open up to the community, but also how community learning centers can sometimes also benefit children. And we see that in some parts of Africa at the moment, where schools are actually being targeted and are forced to close, and the only remaining place for learning are those community learning centers, initially actually designed for adults. So how to make this network a reality also in some of the most deprived rural areas is clearly a challenge, but it's something which is very important. And indeed, we are also better equipped now with the development of technology, including mobile phones, that, as we know, that the penetration, for instance, of mobile phones, even in some of the very poorest parts of some of the poor countries is quite high. So we have here also a device which can be used for accessing learning, so that gives new opportunities.
Well, thank you, David, for picking up on that. And indeed, it is a critical question on more deprived context and or rural. Do any of the other panelists want to contribute to this question? Well, I guess David covered it well. We have a question from Jay Deshmour. She's asking the question about the physical space of learning ecosystems. So actually, I know she works a lot on universities. I guess let's maybe move back to this place-based importance question. How much should a learning ecosystem be place-based and ingrained in a specific territory? Could it be fully digital? Could it be fully global? And if it is local, does it need its own kind of physical space or not? Maybe Rosie, would you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I mean, they can be either in terms of how they exist, but I think for me, some of the most interesting and the most effective are ones that blend physical and digital spaces. So the role of place can be very sort of mobilizing and galvanizing. So, when you think about all the places within a locality where learning takes place, whether that's public libraries, museums, outdoor environments, indoor environments, it's really important to recognize that, and people's participation in activities in their local area can, kind of really give them that sense of identity and belonging and citizenship, which is essential to sort of lifelong learning. But then, we have to recognize that we all spend a lot of time learning online, especially at the moment. And young people growing up today, we spend a lot of time on YouTube and learning in digital environments. So for me, there's a deep interest in how we connect those learnings in different physical and digital spaces on and offline to really build that kind of holistic kind of learner experience throughout life. But I don't think anything will supplement that physical connection that you get through learning in places with other people.
Sandra, I'll turn to you, because Singapore is an interesting place because it's a city state, very focused on the whole this whole smart city conversation, but you're also a learning city. How do you see this link between this very fluid ecosystemic approach and the very kind of place-based approach that Singapore has across the board? Sandra, I think you are on. Oh no, you're not on mute.
Sorry. I agree that, Rosie, that the learning has to be. Firstly, I do not think that 100% online learning suffice. No, because we maybe gamers e-gamers may disagree with me because they think that gaming is a community, is learning. But out of gaming, I think a lot of us will think we learn better. A lot of time is face-to-face working on something. I think complementing learning with synchronized learning online or asynchronized learning with face-to-face, I think is still very important. And the kind of, when we talk about space, as we all know that learning is not confined to schools. Workplace is one of the best places to learn because it's so authentic. Of course, beyond the kind of educations, the kind of more economic kind of learning, the social learning space in libraries is important. And in fact, Singapore have one of the best libraries in the world. Every corner there is a regional library for all of us to go in, and the online resources are fabulous for us. We can access 1,000 newspapers and magazines globally at any one time as a Singapore citizens. So I thought the whole space concept, I think internet will make it more accessible. Today we can access to any kind of learning, whether be it from India or from USA or from Germany or from South America. We can access this kind of learning content very quickly. In fact, YouTube is one of the most used learning platform where anybody want to learn anything quickly, how to pan fry a salmon to anything. So I think that space is no longer just physical. Internet allow us to do that cross over borders. But I would still think that we would, as a human being, we really want to come in contact with people to do things together. And one example that I've seen recently is called a repair coffee shop in Singapore. That every Sunday there's a group of people will settle in one of the housing at the void there of housing block, and they will teach people how to repair electrical appliances so that it can recycle. And basically, as you go there, you learn how to repair, and you have a commitment to stay on for how many weeks to teach the next batch of people how to repair, so that we don't throw things away. And that community is very tightly knitted because there is a purpose. The purpose is to recycle. The purpose is to repair stuff, and you kind of learn how to do it for a purpose. And that is a very good example of how purposeful learning and yet come together, and we can learn from each other. The concept of very useful space. So it's not really the physical space, but I think it's that community belonging and that space is coming together. That's how I feel. Thanks.
Okay. You know,
Maybe,
David, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, Sebastian, is it possible to add something on this point?
Please go ahead.
Yes, I'd like just two comments on this element about the, the special dimension. Space is indeed very important. I think that we something that we saw very clearly, with this COVID-19 crisis and the brutal shift to online and digital learning and teaching, is that it has had really a very significant psychological impact. And in many countries, we see that there are now a lot of problems that people and students and children are not really, feeling well because of this, new environment without physical contact in which they had to actually evolve and learn. So I think that we see very clearly that, digital learning cannot be an alternative to traditional, I would say, teaching and learning. Again, education and learning is also a socialization process, is to be with others. And that cannot be done only online. I think that's we've had a very clear demonstration of that during the pandemic. The second element relates to what I would call, a notion of identity. I think the place is also important because the local level is also the dimension where people can actually, relate directly to their immediate environment. And this is even more so the case in the context of globalization, where sometimes people think that they are very bit lost, where we don't have the capacity actually to influence, their life and their future. Well, the local level give them an opportunity to do so. So there is also this dimension of the empowerment of people, and people giving people through also education and through lifelong learning a possibility to have a say on their immediate environment and to change, their lives through engaging in local development projects in different, areas, and through learning what is needed to make those projects a reality. So this empowerment element, I think, is also very important, and this is one of the reasons why I think the local dimension is so relevant and maybe increasingly relevant in this context of globalization.
For sure. Just quickly, because we had a question from someone in the audience. I will find the name. Just give me a sec. We've been talking a lot about employers, cities, schools, universities, libraries, and Abdel Sarnaji is pointing out that there's one group of people we haven't mentioned is families. How do you react to that? How much do you think it's about the learners, but it's about the learner's family, or are all family members potential learners? Maybe start with you, Alexandra. In Medellin, how are you building that kind of close community, almost neighborhood, family perspective into your thinking around ecosystems?
Pues hemos encontrado también unas grandes oportunidades con las familias, porque además en estos tiempos de COVID lo que se ha vislumbrado, lo que hemos visto es que los roles han cambiado. Hoy el padre hace de maestro, el maestro está por fuera, ya no es el maestro porque está online, está remoto. Nosotros no tenemos esas posibilidades. Nuestra realidad, por ejemplo, como Medellín, es una realidad muy diferente a la que mis compañeros en este panel han dicho en términos, por ejemplo, de computadores, de tecnología en las instituciones educativas. Nosotros hemos tenido que hacer uso de muchas campañas, de donaciones, incluso para llevarle computadores a los estudiantes a sus casas para que se puedan conectar. Entonces las familias, por supuesto, hacen parte de ese ecosistema, de esos ecosistemas de cada uno de los colegios y de cada una de las instituciones educativas, pero hoy jugando un papel importante. pero quiero retomar algo ahí con las familias que David lo mencionaba, y yo soy muy sensible a ese tema, y es lo emocional, lo que está pasando, lo que ha pasado durante todo este año para nuestros estudiantes, para los padres de familia, en nuestro país, hoy en nuestro municipio, por ejemplo, padres que tienen que salir a trabajar y que entonces por estar cerradas las escuelas, los niños están en casa o entonces están en la calle, porque ese entorno protector básico que es la familia a veces y desafortunadamente no funciona para muchos de los estudiantes. Entonces es el colegio quien los protege, y por eso hace tanta falta y toca regresar. O sea, hay que estar, hay que ir regresando. Nuestro país poco a poco, aquí en Medellín, poco a poco hemos ido regresando, y esperamos que a partir de enero pues todas las instituciones puedan regresar bajo otro modelo, un modelo diferente que estamos tratando pues de sobrellevar y de gestionar ahí. Pero las familias juegan un papel fundamental hoy, sobre todo esas familias que son vulnerables, que han tenido que estar encerradas en casa por el tema de la pandemia, pero ¿qué está pasando con los hijos? Y también lo han mencionado acá en este panel, y es esas brechas, esas brechas que se están abriendo. Yo lo mencionaba también al principio, pero ¿cómo vamos a recuperarnos después de esa brecha, después del COVID? ¿Cómo vamos a ir recuperando esa brecha con los estudiantes? Porque hoy realmente ellos no se están encontrando, les hacen falta sus amigos. Los estudiantes, por ejemplo, que este año vivieron su último grado para salir del colegio, fue un grado para ellos pues, traumático. Yo he hablado con muchos de esos jóvenes y nos pedían, por favor, déjenos graduar por lo menos con unos protocolos de bioseguridad, pero por lo menos ver por última vez a nuestros amigos, y las familias también lo pedían así que las familias juegan un papel fundamental, y lo emocional en estos tiempos está jugando, porque al igual que David lo decía, me ha tocado ver, nosotros tenemos acá un programa que es con todo un tema psicosocial, con psicólogos en cada una de las instituciones educativas, un programa que denominamos Entorno Escolar Protector, y es precisamente eso, para proteger a nuestros estudiantes, y esos psicólogos han estado monitoreando en territorio, hablando con todos por teléfono, y realmente, y es lamentable, pues como todos los fenómenos que hemos podido vivir en ese sentido en esta época.
Thank you very much on that. Dear panelists, we're running short on time, but this is great. This is great news. This is proof that there's a lot to unbundle here around learning ecosystems. Anyone want to have a last very quick 10-20 second comment before we conclude?
Yes, just one very quick word, just to note that today is Human Rights Day. And I think it's also the right time to celebrate not only the right to education, but increasingly the right to lifelong learning. And maybe one of the things that we didn't have the time to talk about today is the legal framework and the legal provisions, which are also necessary to actually make access to lifelong learning possible. But I mean, I'm sure that this will be something that we'll be able to take up in one of our forthcoming sessions. Thank you very much again.
Thank you very much, David. Songjo, Alexandra, Rosie, last 10-20 second comment or insights. And if you're good, you're good.
No, I'd like to thank WISE Foundations for organizing this event. I think it's a very useful one and very important for us to talk about the learning ecosystem. In fact, it's getting more and more important, and we have to bring in a lot of partners into this to make it successful, and learning from each other. I think it's good. Like David's work in UNESCO Learning City, I think we're always exchanging view how to do things better. Thank you for the invitation.
I think Alexandra has to leave us in Medellin. So Alexandra, thank you very much for being here. As I was saying, we hope to hear from Medellin soon. Rosie, any last words?
Muchas gracias pues, por haberme invitado. La verdad me uno a lo que estaban diciendo de un placer siempre encontrarme con ustedes, con unos panelistas pues, de lujo, con quienes podemos aprender y podemos hacer precisamente estas redes de aprendizaje que para Medellín es tan importante, y nosotros desde acá poder aprender de ustedes muchísimo, así que muy entusiasmada por participar acá.
Rosie, last words?
Very quickly to say thank you for a great session, and this is a learning ecosystem in and of itself in many ways, and I love David's right to lifelong learning. I think that's a great purpose for our work.
Well, thank you very much for that. And indeed, this is just the beginning. We'll have many more sessions, many more conversations. So please share your feedback, your ideas, and we'll look into them. I'd like to thank all of you, my fellow speakers, for your presence and your insights. I'd like to thank the audience for the great questions and great interaction. I'd also like to thank the team for their help and support in making this session possible. So once again, our next meeting is in 5 days with our special article series and our next panel, in January. So once again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. And we'll be back with more on the learning ecosystems and the Living Lab in the new year. In the meantime, enjoy the coming next weeks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.